quick panel discussions for this afternoon. Topics that I will be sure to be taking notes on because they matter a lot to me. We're going to be looking a little later at getting funded, how to get things funded, whether it is a project work internally, how to take the lead with it, or whether it is something external where you're looking for external funding. How to get your projects funded, I think, is so important for women. We're behind the guys in this area, and we have two very strong speakers who will be talking to us about that. But right now we're going to turn to another topic that I care an awful lot about, and it's negotiations. And I can't wait to see what Erin and her panel have for us. But Erin Arvidlin is our moderator for this panel. She'll introduce the panel. But Erin, I am a huge fan of Erin's. She is a writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. But before that, she was with Barron's, and she wrote the Madoff book, which I call the Madoff book, because it is the book on the Bernie Madoff scandal, how it worked, how we got away with it, the feeder funds, all the things that went in to making Bernie a success before he brought everybody down with him. Really great reading. So, Erin, you take it away.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Mary. Thanks for asking me. Thanks to Dean Tsitsekos for the invitation, and to GIC. So I'm going to introduce our speakers in order of appearance. And also we're going to try and get some really solid takeaways for you guys in terms of negotiations, because that's why we're all here, right? All right, so first up is Dr. Michael Leeds. He's a professor of economics and director of graduate studies in economics at Temple. Thank you for, thanks for coming. Then we have Carmen Kruger, regional vice president at SAP, National Security Services. She's also ex-Navy. And then Monica Mashon, am I pronouncing that correctly? Global head of asset management at AIG. She's a longtime money manager, a lot of experience in emerging markets, and so tackle these women after the panel. They got a lot of experience. So first up, Mike, do you want to go first? He's going to present some slides on our topic. Does our DNA, and boy, this is a hot one, does our DNA make us collaborative deal makers? That's us, ladies. Or does it make us give away the store? From international treaties to Washington gridlock to salaries, we're going to examine how environment and genetics affect our results. So take it away, Mike.
Thank you. And I'm going to be, I guess, sort of setting the stage a little bit for some of the more practical discussion that will come later. Basically, one of the things we want to talk about is the barriers that women face, and in particular, the so-called glass ceiling. The glass ceiling we can think of as something that affects women at the upper end of the income distribution, women at the high end of the corporate ladder, and in particular what it effectively says is that at lower levels, at earlier stages, all workers are treated roughly equally, but then women reach a point where seemingly they can't progress any farther. There seems to be some sort of barrier to rising to the highest levels of the corporate structure. And I guess the very sad possibility is that maybe there is something else that is holding women back. And the question is whether a barrier exists even in the absence of overt discrimination. And in particular, what would happen if the reward structure differs for high-end jobs versus low-end jobs? If there's something very, very different about the way workers are rewarded at the level of the corporate CEO or the corporate vice president as opposed to an entry-level job? And what if women and men responded differently to that reward structure? And in fact, there is a big difference in the basic reward structure, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then about gender differences in the response to that. In particular, the jumping off point will be the 2013 Masters Golf Tournament. I just chose that because I was looking for some very, very close competition. And in the 2013 Masters, Adam Scott won it. but it took 2 extra holes. After 4 days of a tournament, after 72 holes of golf, they still couldn't determine a winner. They had to keep playing until finally it took Angel Cabrera an extra shot on the 74th hole of competition, and for that, Angel Cabrera lost out on $500,000. That by 1 stroke, after 4 days of competition, Scott won $1.44 million. Cabrera won only $864,000. And the question is, why should such a minuscule difference lead to such a huge difference in rewards? Well, there is indeed a reason for this. And what we tell our students in a typical labor economics class is that ideally firms pay workers their marginal value, something we call their marginal revenue product. And all that is the answer to the question, how much more do we produce because we've hired you? And how much more money do we make because we're selling a little bit more because we hired you? So there's the extra output, the marginal physical product, and then the marginal revenue, the extra money we make because now we can sell more because you've helped us produce more. And that has very, very nice properties. In particular, there's a nice continuous relationship between how productive a worker is and how much that worker gets paid. And that's very nice because you want workers to work a little harder, you give them a little bit more money. You give the more productive workers a little bit more money. And so slightly more productive workers make slightly more money. Much more productive workers make much more money. And so we can actually reward workers based on how much they produce. The problem is, in many settings, maybe most settings, the real world is not like that. Rewards are not always tied to the absolute level of performance. And infrequently they are based instead on what we call the rank order. Were you first? Were you second? Were you best? Or were you not best? And this, as we see, is what happens at the Masters Golf Tournament, at the US Open, in many, many athletic competitions. If you win, you get the big prize. If you're on the podium in the Olympics, you get wide recognition and all sorts of opportunities. If you're fourth, well, who remembers who finished fourth in the World Figure Skating competition? Nobody knows. But the point is, though, that this applies not just in the world of athletics, but it applies also in the corporate world. That there is a big difference between being the CEO, being the president, and being an executive vice president. There are big differences in being promoted, that we don't see a world, certainly at the higher ends of the corporate ladder, we don't see a world where small differences in productivity lead to small differences in rewards. Small differences in performance can lead to huge jumps in rewards. Why do firms do this? What's the reason for this? Well, again, as I said, paying a worker his or her marginal product, paying the worker exactly what that worker is worth, provides all the right incentives. You would think that's the way we should be doing things, right? You work harder, you get more. You work a little bit harder, you get a little bit more. You work a lot harder, you get a lot more. But in fact, it's often very, very hard to measure exactly how productive someone is. It's hard to say, you contributed exactly this much. We can do that in some settings where people are paid, for example, on commission. That's exactly what we do. You sell this many cars, you get this reward. You pick this many apples, you get this reward. So at, again, the lower levels of the firm structure, we often see this. But as the tasks get more complicated, as more and more teamwork gets involved, it's often very, very hard to measure a worker's marginal revenue product. It's often very hard to tell exactly how productive a worker is. So monitoring workers can be either very costly, we have to spend all of our time, we have to assign people to measure exactly how well someone's doing, or we're just guessing, and we're often very grossly inaccurate. So what we do is instead we say, well, who is better? It's a lot easier for us to see who is the best worker than to see exactly how productive that worker is. And so we reward the person who's first, the person who does best, the most. We reward people who are less good, less. But we can't tie them exactly to how much they produce. And so what we do is we create a winner-take-all, or at least a winner-take-most environment. We give the person who's best the big prize. The person who's not best gets much less. So we create this gap, and that's where the incentive comes in. You work hard because you want the big prize. You want to be first. You want to be number one, because being second brings you much less. Close counts only in horseshoes, and maybe not even then. Now, what does it have to do with what we're talking about here? Well, there are many, many problems with winner-take-all settings, but one of the negatives that is most relevant for us here is that women seem to respond worse than men to winner-take-all environments. That there is a large psychological literature, a large experimental economics literature that indicates that women do not perform as well as men in such settings, and that women tend to sort themselves into situations that do not have these settings. They try to avoid these settings entirely. And just to point out a few examples, that three economists looked at students at the Technion, which is an Israeli engineering university, so very, very high-skilled people, and they had students at the Technion solve mazes. You know, these little get to the center of the maze without crossing the borders. And they had two different reward systems. They sorted people randomly into groups, and they announced two different reward systems to the groups. They said, in the first one, we're going to reward you according to a piece rate system. That is, we have a prize for how many mazes you solve correctly, and based on the number you solve, we'll give you a certain reward. So if you solve 5 puzzles, you get this reward. If you solve 6, you get that reward. And then they said to the other group, we're going to count how many puzzles you've solved, and we're going to give the person who solves the most puzzles everything. The whole prize goes to the person who solved the most puzzles. And then they measured how women and men did and whether there was a difference in those two settings. It turns out that among women, there was basically no difference, that they did the same in those two settings. Men did much better, significantly better, in the winner-take-all setting. Another study by Booth and Nolan in the Journal of Economic Business and Organization looked at younger students, high school students from England, doing the same sort of thing, solving mazes and puzzles. And what they did was they gave them a choice of the reward system. So they had people competing in a piece rate system, and in the next round they had them compete in a winner-take-all system. And then they said, in the third round, we're going to let you choose which setting you want. The young girls all sorted into the, well, not all, but mostly sorted into the piece rate system. The boys disproportionately sorted into the winner-take-all setting. These are just two studies. There are many, many other studies using various different skills, various different tasks, various different age groups. So there's as young as 4th graders is the youngest group that I've seen, and they all tell very similar stories. The story being that women do not respond nearly as well to winner-take-all settings as men do, and that they tend to sort themselves into different situations. They try to avoid those settings entirely. And so what does this all mean? What are the implications of all this? Again, we don't spend our lives solving puzzles, right? But again, what this suggests is that women are at a disadvantage when it comes to the high end of the corporate structure, where, again, winner take all is the order of the day. If men do better in those settings, men have an advantage, even if there is no overt, explicit discrimination, even if they're being judged fairly. If men respond differently to different reward structures, those reward structures, not the judgment, but the reward structures themselves favor men. And if women avoid settings with those structures, they may sort themselves into parts of the corporate ladder that don't lead to the top of the structure. And so women may actually be sorting themselves out of the competition. If that is the case, then the very sad message of all this is that even in a world without discrimination, there may be, in effect, a glass ceiling facing women. And so even in a world without overt, explicit discrimination, we may not see equality of outcomes. That's the common sense of the literature right now in this area. So I think the rest of the panelists will be taking off from there. That cheery note, I'll turn the floor back over to them.
All right, what are we going to do about this, ladies? Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Dr. Leeds. Okay, so I think right now we're going to let Carmen and Monica respond, and then of course you're going to get a chance. We'll have Q&A at the end of this, so hold your heckling for now. So Carmen, you want to take it away?
Yeah, so I'll just spend 5 minutes, maybe even less than that, kind of framing up my perspective, and it's an amalgamation of experiences, both acting as a lawyer in the Navy and then moving into the business world after my 12-step program. So, and also training. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I work for a company that has done some very interesting gender training for us. That's opened my eyes. So, first things, the term negotiations can be used in a very abstract manner. The reality is we engage in negotiations on a minute-by-minute basis. It's how we interact with people constantly, whether it's with your 2-year-old or whether it's with the cab driver. You are constantly in a state of negotiation. So we have to be mindful of that, and that each negotiation is going to bring about a different set of attributes we want to bring to the table. The second is the concept of nature versus nurture, which we need to attack as a concept. And I like to look at it as nature and nurture in the context of negotiations. Because the reality is that because negotiation is a basic human interaction, and we are going to bring to the table a set of predisposed personality traits that are in our DNA. And then those personality traits are going to be exaggerated, are going to be minimized based on our environment. And I'll give you an example that I thought was apropos. The technology industry, which I'm a part of, went through a very interesting time period in the 90s. And it was to be the mecca of women executives. The technology industry was new, and it was going to bring about a new equality in the ability for women to take senior executive positions, which never came to fruition, by the way. But a very interesting part of the beginnings of those executives, those women executives, and we learned about this in some of these trainings, was they were put through management training. And that management training effectively stripped them and taught them to act like men. So you have a characteristic, a DNA characteristic that may have existed, that had effectively been muzzled by the training and the expectation of the organization, which leads to kind of the second point I'd like to bring to this debate. And that organizational culture is part of that nurture. So depending on where you work will depend on how your negotiation tactics and strategies will mesh with your personality. So let's start, I'll use my anecdotal examples, that's all I really have. In the Navy, there was a protocol to how we negotiated. There was a standard operating procedure. There was a culture of a way that you would approach your colleagues. That was fairly well standardized, and it was very much, it was washed of any gender, period. I'll juxtapose that with when you go into a business negotiation, and I won't certainly indict my company, but I'll indict competitors. That you know, when you go into that negotiation, that corporate culture could dictate that you must negotiate in a certain manner. And in fact, it's either the corporate culture or it's your manager, for that matter. And in sales, you never see it, I think, more dramatically. Depending on how you've been trained, depending on how well your manager receives your ability to take a negotiation a certain way and how much the organization trusts you to do that, will depend on how effective you are on putting your personality into that negotiation. And I'll leave one kind of key point to that, and related to that is sort of the consistent articles or data out there around how women and men behave differently in negotiation. There's a couple of great studies that after offline I'm happy to share with you that I thought were quite interesting. But one is that men tend to be risk takers. We heard about this earlier, right? They'll throw themselves out there. Women tend to be more conservative. So in a negotiation, how might that impact you? How willing are you as a woman to put a controversial fact out there, or maybe even something that's not a fact out there, to help your negotiating position? If that's truly the case, are we at a disadvantage because we are more conservative and want to have the footnotes after every fact that we want to put into a negotiation? A second kind of interesting fact, which I have to admit I was attracted to because I suffer this: women are better negotiators, and this data proves this, at least some of the studies do, are better negotiators for others than themselves. So very great negotiators when it comes to my client. So one of the studies said we should conclude we should have out-of-body experiences when we are to negotiate for ourselves. So it leads to sort of a bottom line. I think that for us to be effective negotiators, we must understand individually what are the traits that make us good negotiators and poor negotiators. Juxtapose that with something I think women do very well, which is not data-driven, but intuitive. We are intuitive. Use your intuition to help you read the situation of who you're negotiating with or against, to improve that position, and don't allow necessarily the common precepts of how women and men negotiate differently to make you compromised in a negotiation. A great example in some of the readings I did were men would presume women would be timid negotiators, or that they wouldn't be Machiavellian in how they would negotiate. And that would hurt them in the process and the outcome. So I think we should be very mindful of that as well as we go into a negotiation. Don't presume the person you're negotiating against is textbook. And finally, you just be self-actualized, because that's going to improve the outcome that you do. Don't try to become the bra brigade woman in the tech industry. You don't have to be an aggressive pit bull to be a good lawyer or to be a good negotiator. So I'll stop there.
All right, great. And Monica, go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. And a special thank you to Michael for laying out some, some factual reality for us to really bounce our ideas off today, because it's always good to start with the way the world is rather than the way that we might like it to be. So I was very intrigued after having this generous opportunity to be on this panel today, and I want to thank my economist colleague Kathleen Stephenson for nominating me, and it's a pleasure to be here. But I was very fascinated by this idea of nature versus nurture, and I was searching for an example that would kind of bring this into focus, and I thought about the two cats that my husband and I recently adopted from the animal shelter. They're 6 years old. They're gorgeous, black, as in Britain they would be called moggies. And one of them is very muscular and sleek and shiny and very insistent. And the other cat is kind of, quiet and fluffy and not quite as insistent, maybe a little bit in its own style, and the fluffy cat's quite happy to cede the food bowl to its more muscular sibling. And I thought, well, of course, people are not cats, but we might be forgiven for thinking that the muscular, insistent cat is the male cat, but she's not. Her name is Lola, and and her brother Louis is quiet and fluffy. So I think it's the point that I want to make here about negotiation is the facts may be and the reality may in most circumstances be exactly as Michael has outlined, which is that women, and I put myself in this category, I'm confident, even as a 4-year-old, I would have put myself into the piece rate camp and gone for the more money for harder work. But at the same time, that isn't always going to be true in negotiations. And so I guess my first point is gender differences exist. They've been studied. They're out there. But we do have to be careful about our own biases. One of the things we talked about over lunch as we were getting together ahead of this was also to think about what other biases might be out there, because in addition to being female, I'm also European, and in particular I have a Swedish parent. And I can assure you that if being reticent is a female trait, you can you can multiply that when you put a Scandinavian parent into the picture. A joke I heard recently that really resonated with me was, how do you know if a Scandinavian person is introverted or extroverted? And the answer is, if they're extroverted, they're looking at your shoes while they're talking to you. There are more things at work than gender, nature versus nurture. So in the course of looking at this as well, I did a little bit of research, and there was a gentleman by the name of Charles Craver, who is a negotiating instructor, and he highlighted some of the things that we've already heard about here today, which is that there is a tendency that he has observed in his classes for men to be use more direct language, for example, in the negotiation, to be more overt, perhaps more forceful in the negotiation, and for women to have a tendency to be perhaps more reticent, use more indirect language, and approach the negotiations from that perspective. And I think a couple of things strike me about that. One is, again, those are tendencies that I've observed over 30 years of working in the financial services world, but they need not always be true. They can be adapted for one's own use, as it were, with coaching, and we can talk about that maybe a little bit later in the Q&A, the nature versus nurture, the nurture piece of that. But additionally, there are things that come with different styles that are important to note as well, which is one of his other observations is that while the men in his class tended to be, stake out their negotiating ground, as it were, or have the floor earlier, the women who were more reticent, or others who were more reticent, might have more of an opportunity to observe what's going on with the other person and then use that to their negotiating advantage. So that takes me to my final point, which is diversity is a good thing, and the styles are the best, I think, when we learn what style we have, whether it's a gender-based style, introversion, extroversion, Swedish mother, whatever you're bringing to your negotiating, you can respect that, and you can also respect what the other person is bringing and learn from that. And this is something that doesn't just apply to negotiations, it also applies to building teams in work environments. So that's my final punchline. Diversity is a good thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. And thanks, Carmen. Okay, so now to the nitty-gritty. I would like to throw a couple of hot potatoes and ask you both, and perhaps you too, Michael, tell me about personally, your sort of best and worst times when you negotiated on behalf of yourself, and then perhaps on behalf of someone else. But first yourself. You want to go first, Monica?
Sure. That's a fantastic question, because the point that Carmen made earlier about how women have a tendency to be better negotiators on behalf of others really resonated with me from my own personal experience and from my observations with women. I'm very fortunate at the moment to be the dean of our inaugural Women's Executive Leadership Institute, where we've nominated very senior women in our organization to go through an 18-month program of maybe the best way to call it is self-actualization, with the purpose of reaching higher echelons in the company. And I think this is a theme, among others, that really stands out. Many women have difficulty asking for things for ourselves. So I can't think of a moment that was actually my worst moment, but I think there was a pretty bad moment when I realized that I'd probably shortchanged myself for a really, really long time because of that tendency. Having said that, again, you know, when you look back on a career that spans over 30 years, you realize that maybe negotiating just for oneself at a particular moment in time gets superseded by the benefits that come from negotiating on behalf of others, because you make a lot of friends that way. So that's maybe not the answer you expected, but.
Oh boy. I always rely on me for controversial statements. So I think my best negotiation, oh please, don't hold it against me, was my negotiation with my husband-to-be. And you know, the question was, you know, do you want to have children? You know, I wanted to have children, but not at all costs. And my discussion with him when we were deciding to go forward with that was, okay, but you know, this is going to be a 50-50 split, right? We're gonna take this on 50-50. And he kind of looked at me and he said, we can do that. And to date, we have kept that 50-50 pretty solid. So I think that was probably my best negotiation. Not that it really was a negotiation, but I think it was looking out for, and I guess to May's point, figuring out that there may be an issue there going forward and trying to tackle that head on, and doing that in advance. So that's a kind of a personal one. My worst negotiation is consistently when I am getting ready to move to a job or doing a different job, and I don't, maybe it's partially because I feel very fortunate. I have the serpentine career, so I have had phenomenal opportunities to do, both at the company I'm at today, before this, and even in the Navy, do really cool things. And I always felt like it was such a privilege asking for, not that I could do that in the Navy, but asking for more salary or asking for something else. I just was always very reticent to do that. I recognize my male counterparts are very happy to do it, and I probably need to sit and self-actualize on that. But I made fun of. Yeah, exactly. We're going to talk. I'm going to get called to the principal's office now because of that.
Michael?
Well, first of all, I want to compliment Carmen on her choice of a husband. I think when children and husbands are sort of like puppies and kids, they say, yeah, we'll walk the dog and we'll feed it. And
Right.
after you get the dog, it usually doesn't work out that way. So you're very lucky. But I guess, you know, I'm an economist, and I like to behave in an economic fashion. And I guess the best thing I did was the thing that got me what I wanted, came when I was up for promotion, actually, to full professor. I happened to, in fact, be in Japan at the time. And I had been assured, oh, it's a done deal, it's all fine, it's all good, everything's going forward, everything's, you know, you have approved here, approved there, this, that. It got to the upper reaches of the administration, and they said, no. And they said, in fact, we think you should have about 20 more publications. I was like, oh, really? And I said, and I just after my wife pulled me off the ceiling, I sent a message to the provost and said, you know, let's look at this. I'm going to respond to this in one of two ways, because I'm tenured. I've got a lifetime position here. And I can either sit in my office and read the New York Times and not bother doing any research and do the minimum amount of teaching and just have a good time. Or I could do nothing but research and completely ignore my students and do no service to the department or the school or the university. Or I could be an active member on all levels, and it's up to you. What would you rather have happen? And I got a call in Tokyo saying, you know, I think there was probably a mistake made. And so again, I mean, I guess if there was a lesson to me from that is make sure the other person, or try to frame it less as I want this and you're going to give me this, and set it up as some sort of zero-sum game, and to say, you know, it's really in your interest to give me what I want because you're going to get something out of it too. Mm-hmm. And so that, I guess, was sort of my high point of negotiations.
All right. Sounds like the nuclear option, but once you explained it, it made more sense. I'm curious, we talked a little bit about this over lunch, which was words to avoid in the workplace. We talked about phrases like I think, I feel, which a lot of us use to our detriment. Why is that?
I think the why part is very difficult to answer. The why part probably has to do with familiarity, comfort zones, what people are used to. If we go into, Sheila Bair actually talked about this very example, and again, it resonated with my own experience, and I have a feeling it resonated with many people in the room here, and that is somebody says something in a meeting, and 10 minutes later, a different person says what one thinks is possibly exactly the same thing, but it is possible that the people in the room didn't hear it the first time. And it may be that those qualifier words initially drown out the actual message because they are not delivered in a way that everyone else in the room can understand them. And so I think that one of the things, again, that we can learn from here is to watch how people deliver information, deliver messages. One of the bits of coaching that I've got in my career is give me the elevator speech. Don't give me all the fluff around it. Don't give me the, I don't have time to listen to the story. Give me the punchline first, or give me the elevator speech why I should buy into this, and then we can talk about the details around it.
And maybe we can talk about why we should avoid those words. In other words, why avoid the use of the word I in general? Tell us why that's a good idea.
So first of all, to snowball off what Monica is saying and tie it back to a lot of the kind of gender training or gender data out there, those terms, I think, I feel, are verbal cues for an emotional argument or an emotional discussion. So that ties into, if you buy into that being a predominantly female trait, then if you are negotiating with somebody who has read that literature, you have sort of fallen into a trap that they will potentially use to their advantage. So that's just one thing to just throw out there. Why shouldn't we use? I mean, I may not be the problem. The think and feel might be the problem, because clearly, if you're stating it, then you think it. And so it not only indicates redundancy, but it indicates hesitation, an ability now for you to not take the risk, to go back again to some of the data and women's sort of predispositions. I can hide behind my emotion or my thoughts. It's not a fact. And that can, I would not to use that in a negotiation because you're arguing about facts. The moment you make an emotional argument is, I think, the moment you begin to slide away from success and the outcome of that. And a lot of that also depends on who you're negotiating against. But in business negotiations, emotion can play a role, but it can't be the central and only role in that discussion, that discourse. So, my 2 cents worth.
Again, I feel that in some ways women, through the traditional sex roles in the family, have been set up, I don't want to say for failure, but to set up at a disadvantage, in the sense that the way one negotiates with a child, the way one negotiates with a spouse, is very different from the way one negotiates with an arm's length negotiation with someone at the workplace. And to what is useful and productive when dealing with a 5-year-old or an adolescent or a spouse, which again may be the same thing, would not necessarily work in the business place. And so I think that in some ways the cues that women get to negotiate successfully as a spouse are very, very different from what they have to use in the world of work. And I think that there is a potential conflict there in those two different roles.
Okay, so we've hit the 15-minute mark, and I would say, actually, I disagree with you. I think dealing with bosses is a lot like dealing with children. Managing expectations, dissipating temper tantrums, and generally, like distracting them with, bright ideas. So, all right. So, first question. Yes, this lady right here. There's a microphone coming.
I'd like to take Erin's comments a little bit further and ask Michael a question, and that's that I absolutely, no humor at all, think that the same kinds of negotiation strategies work in all different settings. And I think everybody, we're all human, and if negotiations in a workplace happen at a human level rather than at a going to say inhuman, wrong word, but at the arm's length, I think we'd be better off. I would love to have heard you talk about what is better for the organization, a piecemeal strategy, what gets better results, or a winner-take-all? In which kind of organization do you have more commitment by all of the workers, a winner-take-all strategy or one in which it's piecemeal? And I would really like to hear an analysis of, by all of you, and I'm too long-winded here, but I think the women's innate abilities are what could make companies a lot better. And rather than say that we have to perform like men in the workplace differently than we perform at home, perhaps the answer to better workplace and more employee commitment is if people recognize that women's tactics and strategies and negotiation were better off. But my opinion, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Well, I'm certainly, let me stick to what I'm more qualified to speak about, which would be where one sees piece rate versus winner take all, which again is not quite fair because it's not winner take all in the sense that we don't say vice presidents are not compensated, but but there's a big difference in prize levels. And again, as I indicated, in areas where it's very difficult or very costly to measure with any precision or accuracy how well someone does, that's where we tend to see these what we call economic contests. So where it's very easy to measure a worker's output, where it's very easy to measure workers' productivity, that's where we see what we call piece rate, where we can very accurately and very cheaply measure exactly how productive a worker is. And again, unfortunately, as one moves up I'll call it the corporate ladder, such measurement becomes increasingly difficult and increasingly complex and potentially costly, that you just can't have someone standing over every worker's shoulder measuring exactly how productive that worker is all the time. And so that's why we tend to see these things at the higher ends of corporate structures.
Yeah, I'll throw out, I'll attempt to just cite some research. Barbara Annis in her gender intelligence kind of, body of work indicates that you're onto something, which is effectively having a more mixed environment of executives, of women and men, have a statistical significance in the earnings per share of the company, of the success, the metrics of success of that company, which is you don't want all of one or all of the other. And so having a mixed skill set of how women may approach a problem differently, whether we call it piecemeal or winner take all, that ends up dividing that organization, having that mix is important. And sales is a really interesting place for that because that is a purely winner take all environment. It's very clearly cut, very clearly measured, and it's highly competitive. But having women engaged in that sales management rank is an important factor in the success. So that's the data I have. I would definitely point to that body of work because it supports what I think you instinctively are saying.
I would just add that it's certainly a lot nicer to work in a collegial environment, and to the extent that many different kinds of voices come together to make a team successful. That speaks to greater diversity, and I agree with the comment that our goal here ultimately should not be to have, to train women and everybody else to behave in one single way. I think the organization and the teams working in it are going to be vastly better off by having a diversity of viewpoints, a diversity of ways of working, rather than a single, especially if it feels like a winner-take-all kind of way, which doesn't make you want to jump out of bed and go to work every day.
Next question. Thank you for all your comments. And I was struck, Michael, by one of your comments with regard to no glass ceiling, or even if there is no glass ceilings, there might be some discrimination at some level because of the winner take all framework. And I wonder to what extent in corporate America and in corporations in general, I should say, we haven't seen in fact a kind of discrimination that is taken just by having chosen this type of model. And this type of model that has been in fact developed in business schools, developed by consultants, and essentially there is a convergence of thinking in terms of what is the best structure, so that you start to get a self-selection bias of people who thrive in such a particular environment. And at the end of the day, you do get an implicit discrimination and glass ceiling that is being formed. So what is your question?
Well, I think there's a lot going on in what you said. And one of the things, I guess, I would try to separate some of the threads. One is what we mean by discrimination. Again, as an economist, I have a very particular definition of discrimination, which is the use of an irrelevant characteristic to make an economic judgment. So the fact that I am not a starting center for the Philadelphia 76ers or a starting shortstop for the Philadelphia Phillies is not discrimination in any way, shape, or form. And so in the sense that, we have to sort out again what we mean by discrimination in the workplace. Discrimination in the workplace could take place if we say, for example, you're a woman, I don't like working with women, I don't want you here. That's discrimination. We could talk about discrimination, again, we're talking about employer discrimination as opposed to discrimination by other employees or by customers or something like that, strictly discrimination by the firm. We could talk about discrimination by the firm if we say, even if I legitimately don't think that women are as productive as men. And in fact, that may even, for the sake of argument, that may even be true. Women as a group may not be as productive as men as a group. Even accepting that is true, and I'm not saying it is true, but even if we were to accept that as true, making a statement about you personally is discrimination, okay, based on a group characteristic. So I guess what I'm saying is, when we talk about discrimination, we have to say that there is something, we are making a judgment based on something that is irrelevant for your situation specifically. If there is a reward structure that causes certain people to perform well and certain people to perform not as well, and we are making a judgment based strictly on how productive that person is, then that is not discrimination. We may not like the reward system. We may want to try to change the reward system. We may want to change how people respond to that reward system, but it is not discrimination. So at least as a starting point, that would be one of the things I would say.
Well, I could answer the question, which is that there is a glass ceiling, which I think was your question. I mean, I know I've experienced it, in publishing. It's a very male-dominated world. There are very few female editors, and that's largely because, we try to have lives outside of work and have families, and I think we discussed the on and off ramps earlier today. So it exists. I don't think that's in question. I think the question is, can we negotiate our way to, right, which is what we're talking about, to something that's equally rewarding, maybe not in terms of pay or promotion. So next question.
So this is a question that weaves together the global nature of the companies that you work for and the places that Michael has been, and public policy. The ratio between CEO pay and the average worker wages for a U.S. flag company, in other words, a U.S. Company that's domiciled, headquartered in the U.S., is dramatically larger, tons of times larger than the ratio of CEO pay to average worker pay in other flags, other corporate headquartered countries. Is that due to public policy differences, say in terms of taxes, for example, or whatever? Or is it just somehow that these other countries have a different social contract? So it's not a policy contract, it's a social contract. Whereas, America's kind of the John Wayne winner-take-all kind of attitude. So, and you can speak either by your own companies or not, but I think that this is an important question, because if it's a policy-oriented issue, then that's something that we can, in principle, do something about.
Monica, you want to take that to start?
I'm woefully ill-equipped to answer such an important question. I think whether it's a public policy question or not, I think is probably a matter of great debate. I can't help but think of the slide, which probably everybody saw, that one of the earlier speakers had up. And for full disclosure, I must say I am not a U.S. citizen, so forgive me for pointing out that this slide was the United States, state by state, and who were the highest paid public officials or public government workers in each of the states. And I was astonished, but perhaps not surprised, that most of the states were either football coaches or basketball coaches. And so I think the way that I would answer the question in a very inexpert way is to say that as citizens of any country, we do make some choices when we elect people or allow certain situations to persist, whether it be corporate imbalances or whether it be, you know, government or state-owned university imbalances. I think that we all need to kind of look in the mirror and say, you know, what happened here, and what do we do about, what are our values? You know, I have parents from different countries, so I can say that, you know, each country seems to have its own characteristics. I do think that in Scandinavian countries, which are much smaller, so perhaps more manageable in terms of homogeneity of thinking around these things, there is more of a sense of, or at least in my upbringing, there's more of a sense of community, and of course that can all go the wrong way as well. So it's a very complex question.
I see there. Yeah, of course.
And I hate to argue by anecdote, but I spent 2 years living in Japan, and to argue that it is a sort of a social compact, where I worked at Temple University's Japan campus, we were right next to a home for like an Office Depot kind of building, and there was a parking lot in the basement of that building, and every day, rain or shine, there was a man there waving cars into the parking lot, and he was there in a uniform, and he was very crisply and very professionally waving people into the parking lot. He clearly took pride in what he did, and in Japan, that was the norm, that there's a much smaller difference between the highest paid and the lowest paid employee. And there is a pride in work. Everyone is in some ways a professional, whether you're an executive for Sony or whether you're some guy waving people into a parking lot. And that was a remarkable, it was a really kind of an aha moment for me to see that and to appreciate that. Now, having said that, almost any Japanese woman would regard our labor market as a paradise. That even though the disparities between top and bottom are much smaller in Japan, women are much worse off in Japan, in the Japanese labor market, than in the U.S. by any metric you choose to look at. So we can't, I would hesitate to make a direct tie between differences and the position of women.
So we're at the hour. Last question, I think, for both of you, I wanted to know was, would you recommend coaching? You talked about this for salary negotiations.
I think I'm going to be getting some yes. The answer is yes. I think, and I think coaching and I think mentorship. I have to tell you, you know, even whether it's internal negotiations or not, if you have a mentor around who can help you understand in any business transaction you're doing, whether it's self-benefiting or to the corporation, that's hugely important. And then certainly the network like you're creating, we have a women's business network, incredibly helpful as well, but yay on the coaching.
I just have to echo that. Years and years ago when I was in college, I sheepishly went to get a tutor because I wanted to do better in one of my classes, and the person who was providing me with the tutor said, oh look, you know, all the smart students are looking for tutoring, and I immediately felt better. And I thought, you know, on coaching, look, if you can get a leg up any way possible, go get it.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all very much. Great panel. Thank you.